Welcome to our pre-Pesach virtual tour. What was Paro doing in Israel? When I say Israel, you know that I really mean Canaan, but it sells better when you say Israel. And I would like to just explain why I'm doing this. We usually, before Pesach, I talk about mythology, Egypt, the Nile, the Ten Makot, and all these amazing insights that the 150 years of since the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone have enabled us to do. And I have some of those online because I just started a homeschool for English speakers, which I'm trying to launch now. So I have a free tour you could watch. I think I sent it to you by email if you're on the mailing list, and happy to send it to you afterwards. You'll get an email with the recording and lots of links for the things we talk about. So I decided to do something a little bit different, which is interesting in and of itself because the impact of the pharaohs in Israel is quite an incredible story. But also it does shed a little bit of light on the conversation of dating Yetziat Mitzrayim, dating the Exodus, which many people just take for granted is Ramses the Great, but they don't really understand the broader context of what that means when there are other opinions that say, Ramses might be 200 years too late. So what does that mean? So I'd like to go into this a little bit, and that will hopefully shed some light on that. It's not the main focus, but it does give you some value to understanding that conversation. So let's get right into it. Before we go into the museum and to the different sites in Israel, I'd like to first do a really brief overview of the questions that we're going to look at, which is which pharaohs came to Israel, when, and why. And the second, and we're going to answer these throughout the tour, but the most important thing is just to understand the timeline. And this is not something I want to spend too much time on. I want to do this really, really briefly, but just to give you a sense, because these ideas are going to tie in later as we understand which pharaohs, when, what does each pharaoh mean. So I made this quick little timeline of the dynastic ancient Egypt, which basically means from Pharaoh number one. Pharaoh number one, or Dynasty Zero, there's different names for it. Basically, the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, which is a concept we have discussed in the past, that Egypt, Mitzrayim is double. It means upper and lower together. And that once Egypt was united under the first king of Egypt, we're going to call Pharaoh, we'll see later what his real name is, that begins the first dynasty of Egypt, or Dynasty Zero, and we call that the Old Kingdom. Okay, so we're going to look at all of this because this is 3,000 years of history, and I want to break it down for you really simply. And the value of a recording is that you could always review this slowly and check out the notes so you could catch up. I just want to sort of bring you up to speed. So the Old Kingdom, we'll see most of these artifacts, by the way. So this is what's called the Narmer plate, and that's the image of Narmer, the first pharaoh. And that's the Old Kingdom. So we're talking about 5,000 years ago, a very long time ago. And this is a dynasty that lasted for, as you can see, about 1,000 years. And they built the first pyramids, but like the step pyramids, not the big, fancy, majestic ones that we know in Giza today, but they still made pyramids. The Middle Kingdom is basically the time of the Avot. So Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, that's the Middle Kingdom. And there's this period of instability in between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, which is called an intermediate period. And there's a bunch of those, basically periods of instability. The second intermediate period is considered to be the Hyksos, which you may have heard of, which means Hekachasut. It means rulers from foreign lands, Asiatics, basically people from the area of Canaan and north of Canaan who controlled parts of Egypt. And that was a more friendly environment for, let's say, Yaakov and Yosef and foreigners to settle in Egypt, and this leads into slavery. So we have no question about the Exodus being during what's called the New Kingdom. The question is when, because you could see that there's quite a range. You're talking about around 400 years. King Tut is from the New Kingdom. Ramses the Great, who's on his chariot, is from the New Kingdom. And we have a bunch of other kings who are the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom begins with a king who basically who banishes the Hyksos, and there you can say, Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef, the pharaoh known as Yachmoses, who was a local Egyptian who decided to get rid of these foreigners, and basically he doesn't care for Yosef, right, and doesn't care about all of that stuff. So that's an interesting conversation which you can get into. But the New Kingdom is a wide range, and somewhere within there we have the Shi'abud, the subjugation, and the Geulah, the redemption, leaving Egypt, the Exodus. So it's somewhere within this period of time. The third intermediate period, we're going to see this stone later on. That's basically Beit Rishon. That's the first temple period, and the late kingdom is already the Greeks and the Romans. It's not important, and the Persians. It's not important for us. So Narmer, I'm going to keep this here, and now we're going to jump into the museum, and I'll leave this as a teaser as to what we're talking about. So let's begin with our tour. So first of all, we're talking about the pharaohs in Israel. So we're actually going to be staying in Israel, not really going to Egypt. So let's jump into the Israel Museum. So first things first, in the Israel Museum, there is a hallway which is called Neighboring Cultures, which is unique in the Israel Museum because everything found in here is loans and donations, but it's not from Israel. So this mummy, which is empty, there's no real mummy in it, and these canopic jars, which are really cool, they were used for the storage of the internal organs. All of this stuff is from loans and collections from around the world. It's from Egypt. It's not actually from Israel. I want to contrast that. But first, I want to just show you that there's a few cool things here. So there's some scarabs, these little beetle-shaped rings that have signatures. We have images of the pharaoh. We have some very famous pharaohs like this guy here. 1 second, I went a little too far. I want you to just see, this is the image of the pharaoh and his chariot. We'll see him later. So, the glass pane it's a bit of a pain. It's bothering us. 1 second, here we go. Slowly, there we go. So that's Ramses the Great. It's just discussing the concept of what the pharaoh is. And this is a kneeling figure. It's broken, of one of the most important pharaohs called Thutmose III. We'll get to him later. I'm just sort of using this as a teaser. But all of this stuff is from Egypt, like these little statuettes of different deities in ancient Egypt or mummies of different sacred animals. All of this stuff is from Egypt. Let's see the Egyptian stuff that was actually found in Israel. So when you walk into the archaeology wing, here's the hallway. Yeah, you walk straight in here. And what you see is these coffins. Now, these coffins, they're called anthropoids because they look like people. They're kind of what a mummy would look like if we were making it in an arts and crafts class. I wouldn't say that it's high level. The proportions are off. Like they clearly were trying to make mummies. Now, where is this from? A couple weeks ago, there was a major operation in our current war in a place in Gaza called Deir el-Balach. This is from Deir el-Balach. This is from Gaza. This is from the time of the Ramesside dynasty, meaning Ramses the Great's descendants. So roughly 3,200 years ago. This is from Israel. Who made this? What is it doing here? And we found dozens of these. And I'll just add a little juicy detail. These were donated, quote unquote, or sold to the museum for a nice, kickback by the widow of Moshe Dayan. Some of you might know what that means. Moshe Dayan was quite the antiques collector. And when I say collector, I mean more like I want that, and he would take it. So it's a funny story. It's a fun background story. But that's all I'm going to mention about that for now. But I want to show you what's inside these little characters. So what is inside these anthropoids? Let's take a closer look. We're just further back into the museum. We just skipped, that's the hallway we were just in. And here it is. Now this one is the Israeli one who's saying, Savlanut, chake rega, right? And this is what it looks like inside. There's not, let's just say there's not much to see in here. Well, you could say that it was plundered. So yeah, there's a few bronze mirrors. There's some dishes, whatever the thieves didn't deem worthy stealing. So that's what we have. But all we have here is their items, and we have some pictures that look Egyptian, but we don't really know who was in here. We really have no clue. It's one of those mysteries because, and here, coffins in human form, they have you can read the plaque, but the bottom line is we don't know who made these. They were either Egyptians who were stationed in Israel, and we'll see why that's important very soon. They're either Egyptians who are stationed in Israel, but they don't have access to an Egyptian workshop to make a proper mummy, or these are Philistines, maybe, because it's from Gaza, or maybe Canaanites, who are trying to imitate the dominant culture in the region, but don't really know how to do it. That's basically what we're looking at, right? And that's why this area is in the Canaanite part of the museum. So it talks about the Canaanite period, and I want to show you that right here. Okay, so we're going to jump around in just a moment, but I want you to see this. Haknani az ba'aretz, we're in the Israel Museum. This is Canaanite. This is a stela from the Canaanites found in Beit Shean. That's going to be very important in just a moment. These wrestling lions, like a scene out of The Lion King, you know, the slow motion, Simba and Scar facing off, or maybe with Nala before she flips him over. And this is a little dog trying to chew off the lion's backside, and the lion's like, give him some slack before he probably flattens him. So that's what's going on. And we're right next to the remains of the largest Canaanite city of Chatzor. So that's going to tie in to a few things very soon. Now, I'd like to do the following. Before I get into, let's say, all of the details, I want to just take kind of an overview and show you something important about the cities that the Egyptians controlled in Israel. So let's take a closer look at basically at the way this is structured. So here is the bridge between Egypt here and the Fertile Crescent. Basically, we're in the smack bang in the middle of the Fertile Crescent. This is Mesopotamia, and here is Israel. Now, the cities that I marked in green, with the exception of Chatzor, which I need to change into red, the cities that I marked in green are cities where the Egyptians not only left buildings, stelas, victory stelas, they left a footprint. These were cities that were actually controlled by Egyptians. There was an Egyptian governor or ruler under different pharaohs in these cities. And I'd like us to see what all of these have in common. So take a close look, right? You see their location. What do these cities have in common? So I'm going to draw it to make it easier for us to conceptualize. Here it is, right? And I hope this sends the message of what this is. They're basically controlling what's called the Via Maris, the way of the ocean, or what's called in the Torah, Derech Eretz Plishtim. Velo nacham Elokim, Derech Eretz Plishtim. Right, when we left Egypt in Parashat Beshalach, God deliberately took us the roundabout way so that we don't get cold feet and run back to Egypt for a sign of trouble. Because you go through Via Maris, Egypt had fortresses along the way. There were the Philistines. We're just going to run away. So you take us around so there's no other way and you have to fight. Okay, so this is called Via Maris or Derech Hayam. And this will answer our first question of why were the Egyptians here? And why did they station Egyptian rulers in this on this direction? So if you want to control the trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia, this is it. And we're talking about Eretz Canaan, which, just to remind everyone, that Canaan isn't one person. It's like not exactly a coalition, but it's a general term for 7 different nations. Chiti, Amori, Prizi, Yevusi, Girgashi, right? It's a bunch of different people. But Canaan means merchant. It's merchants. This is a land where you do business because you're in a very strategic location. So the Egyptians wanted a piece of the action. They wanted to make sure that they're in control of the area. And there was always back and forth fighting with the Canaanites about who's controlling these ways. So that's the main reason they're here. And it's the path that basically takes you to Mesopotamia. And then you move inland on your way in. So we're going to get back to this. It's going to come into play very soon when we talk about, let's say, the Battle of Megiddo and some other important places. But this is what I want you to see. And now I'm going to take you to places where we found things that belonged to Egyptians, but they aren't where Egyptians necessarily ruled. But we found evidence of them, having trade connections with the Canaanites in these places. The first city built in Israel is here in Tel Arad. near Beersheba. Not modern Arad, but biblical Arad, but it's around the corner from here, basically. So let's go back to the Israel Museum. And we were on this plaque, Haknani Az Ba'aretz. So now look, we're gonna look at that in a moment, but I want you to just look where we are. This little exhibition here is all about the first cities, right? And this is a picture of Arad. Arad is a major Canaanite city. It's almost 5,000 years old. It's ancient, and these are all things that were found in Arad. Everything from pottery to household stuff, pestle and mortar, a grindstone, weapons, jewelry, household stuff. And then we have this pottery. Now, I want to, first of all, just show you from afar. It's going to be a little hard to tell, but you'll have to take my word for it. The style of this pottery is called the Abydos style, which is in Egypt. This is an Egyptian style of pottery. So, the Egyptians and the Canaanites are trading. This is found in Canaan. And this little stone here, the black stone, is an Egyptian stone. It's not local to Israel. And we'll see why that's important in a moment. I want to focus on this gigantic jug that has a little picture here. See if you could see when I move in before I switch to slides. There's a carving. You can kind of see a bird, it's a falcon, standing on the top of a building. Now, what is this? Now I'm going to take you back to our story of Narmer. So this is Narmer. This is in the British Museum. It says there below, cast of the reverse of a slate ceremonial object representing Narmer, one of the earliest kings of Egypt, slaying an enemy. And the original was actually in Cairo. So this is King Narmer. Now, those of you who have been on my other tours, you'll notice he's wearing the hat of Upper Egypt, and he has his sandal bearer behind him. And there's all kinds of stuff. You can analyze this. There's a lot of stuff online about this. And there's a falcon on the top right. The falcon represents the sky god Horus, who is the representation of the Pharaoh. So when they say that the Pharaoh is kind of a god, the god that we are talking about is Horus. Pharaoh is a reincarnation of sorts, an aspect of the god Horus, and that's part of his name. His name is in hieroglyphics on the very top. It's kind of a catfish and a petal. That's just basically how you write his name in hieroglyphics. So this is Narmer, and you see that there's two pictures, and on the right there is a circle that's created by these elongated necks of these lines. It's all imaginary, but that's basically for mixing of cosmetics. So it's a plate for cosmetics, but it has the image of the legendary Narmer. So it's called the Narmer plate. This is the uniter of Egypt, the first pharaoh. And why am I mentioning him? Narmer, that's his name on the top. It's a catfish and a little stick, because the god Horus this is the eye of Horus. Famous. If I say Egypt, this is probably one of the things that come to people's mind, is that the first kings of Egypt were actually not called Pharaoh. Pharaoh is from the time of the New Kingdom, from the time of Ramses, more or less, where the name Pharaoh became synonymous with the ruler. But the old kings were called Horus. So it's not Horus Narmer, it's Pharaoh Narmer, it's Horus Narmer. And this is the hieroglyphics that represent his name. The falcon on top tells you this is a king. We have the name of the first pharaoh of Egypt in Israel. And we found 4 of these. That's quite a thing to see. So that means that from the very beginning, before Egypt was a conquering empire, they were an economic force, let's just say. They were doing business with the Canaanim, with the Canaanites. So that's the first thing I wanted you to see. The second one, I'm going to take us back to our display. And now we found 4 of those. I think I mentioned that. Now take a look at this. So right here, last year they switched this little character and this little ivory, which is from Megiddo, by the way. So this ivory is going to be important later. Last year, 2023, marked 100 years to the discovery of King Tut. So in honor of that, they put right where that little glass case is on display the following. I took a picture for you. One second. Oh, I skipped this. I had to mention this because we were looking at Chatzor a second ago. This fragment of a sphinx was found in Chatzor. I have the information here below, 2013, Hebrew University. And the name that's listed between the legs of this marble, or Chatzor, of marble, I think granite, a sphinx, is Menkaura. Menkaura was the builder of one of the first pyramids. And this was found in Chatzor 1,000 years after Menkaura's lifetime. So, and then was found in secondary use. They like chopped it up, used it as a stone. So there's some interesting stuff going on. That's why I mentioned Chatzor. But now here's our picture. So we have a little representative King Tut. We know that he was a very young king, 16, 19, probably died in some kind of a chariot accident. And right there in that display, because it was 100 years to King Tut, they displayed 2 rings that were found in the south of Israel in a place called Tel El-Jul, which is easy to remember because these are jewels. These are the 2 rings. And they bear different names of the Pharaoh. He has his birth name, his throne name, whatever. So these are the names of King Tut, and these rings were found in Israel from King Tut, which means that King Tut had representatives who controlled Israel, and they were stationed abroad, right? That's an incredible thing. Now, when we talk about King Tut, I just want to mention, because I mean, I'm sure you all know this, but it's worth mentioning that King Tut is of the New Kingdom. He is way before Ramses the Great, but we'll talk about where he fits. But King Tut was famous simply because we found his treasures. He wasn't known for too many achievements other than being the grandson of the hated Tutankhamun, who tried to change the religion of Egypt. So he's not really a popular guy, but we found his treasures, incredible stuff that's basically, if you want to look at the melachot, the crafts that were necessary for building the Mishkan from the perspective of Egyptian archaeology, it's like these skills were known at the time. They were available, and this is an example. We found a chariot. We found a game here of Senet that's like in mint condition, and so on and so forth. So this is King Tut. Now let's continue with our story. I would like to go back to the Israel Museum and now take you somewhere in Israel which has a modern representation of these lions. So let's assume for a moment you're driving up to the Golan Heights or to the Kinneret, and you take the Jordan Valley Road, like Highway 90, right? So you're definitely going to pass Beit She'an, and that's from Beit She'an. So here's what I want to show you. When you drive up Highway 90, there's a few roundabouts where you see representations of archaeology that was found in Beit She'an. So this is one. This is one of the synagogue floors that has the Aron Kodesh and 2 menorahs. We've seen the mosaics of this before. So this is one. And then you keep on driving, and you get to the next one. There's a bunch of them, but this is the cool one. And here are our lions, right? And now you know exactly where they're from. They're from Beit She'an, okay? So this was our introduction, but we're still not at the we're not in like the really hardcore Egyptian stuff. This is just like something from the museum in Israel Canaanites. Now let's get into the hardcore stuff. So we're going to take you to the old city. And we're going to talk about the British Mandate in the end. We're talking about General Edmund Allenby. But before we get to Allenby, which is really our closing point, I want to talk about the British Mandate. So we are now outside Herod's Gate, or Sha'ar HaPrachim, in different names, English and Hebrew. But it's called Sha'ar HaPrachim because there's these flowers in these circles on top of the gate. And if you keep on going down the road, let's just say up, first of all, if you go up, you'll get to Damascus Gate, Sha'ar Shechem. And if you continue going down, you're going to get to the Lion's Gate, Sha'ar HaArayot. So that's where we are. And that's that you could sort of see the Hebrew University, kind of, around the, if you continue going down there. You'll sort of see it. Now, see there's this octagon tower right here. This is the Rockefeller Museum. What is the Rockefeller Museum? The Rockefeller Museum is a museum which was built to house the antiquities, the archaeology, which was found in Israel, exclusively in Israel, and exclusively during the British Mandate, which basically means between 1917 and 1947. That's it. And since then, they basically barely changed anything in the museum. It's part of the contract. You can't change anything in the museum. They're like, they sometimes finagle a few things, but you really, like, everything's ancient. It's a museum of what museums used to look like. And it was actually funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr. So, you know, Rockefeller Center in New York City. He was a big philanthropist, and he gave the money for this. And that's the Rockefeller Museum. And it's free, by the way. And it's, you know, check their times. It's basically under the Israel Museum. I want you to just see it from above. Here it is. I'll show you some more pictures as well, but here it is, right outside the. It's not a great shot, but you see the. There's 4 different towers, and there's a kind of an entrance. We'll just move up to the entrance. Not a great view. But the museum itself has some great history. It's when you want to talk about the War of Independence, this was one of the places where we were standing and fighting, and there's all kinds of stories. When you stand in the library there's a bullet hole in one of the pillars where apparently one of the Jewish soldiers was praying mincha, and he bowed down, and at that moment a Jordanian sniper shot and hit the wall, and you could see that bullet hole in the library. So this is the building. It's a beautiful building. I'm just showing you the outside before we jump in, because the building is worth mentioning before we talk about what's in here, because they found all this Egyptian stuff. So this building was made by, I think his name was Henry St. Barby, but basically a British architect who built many buildings around Israel. He built the post office on Yafo Street, the big one. He built the Kaduri Agricultural School. I mean, he built, I think, more than a dozen buildings in Israel during the British Mandate. Beautiful stuff. And there's archaeology all over the place. It's kind of dilapidated. It's kind of sad. I mean, it's fun that you could jump on stuff and touch things, and I have a picture standing here with my tefillin, but it's a little bit dilapidated. Before we jump in, I want to talk about the architecture. Not only the builder, but the designer of these pictures. All over the museum, there are pictures designed by a Jewish artist whose name is Eric Gill. And before we jump into the museum, I want you to see a little bit about these images and what they represent. So let's take a closer look. Here's our Roman rubber duck. That's Herod's Gate, and here it is. I'll send you information about this in the video description. So this picture represents the meeting between Asia and Africa, with this tree representing Israel. So you basically have Israel right there in the middle between Asia and Africa, and those are the cultures that are represented in that picture. Now let's jump into the museum. So look at this beautiful courtyard right in the center, which has, it's not only running water, but it has tons of artifacts that are just sitting there. And you could pose with them for pictures. They actually filmed a movie here. It got a lot of criticism because it's very irreverent and slapstick, but it's called a Yehudim Ba'im, and they actually filmed season 3 where they have scenes of Kohanim. This is where they filmed it. And each corner here has a story. I'm going to keep it simple because I don't want to overwhelm with this. I want to get to the meat, but I want to show you some beautiful things here. That's the tower that we saw. You need to have connections to climb up to the top. I never did, but if you have the right connections, you can. And this alcove here with the fountain is full of a beautiful Armenian. It's called quadra seca, I think is what it's called. It's a certain technique of working with ceramics, and the Armenian artist who made this was actually brought into Israel to renovate the Dome of the Rock. And his name is David Aharonessian, and David Aharonessian actually took under his wing a lot of Armenian orphans when we're talking about the Armenian genocide by the Turks, by the Ottomans. So he took them under his wing and trained a generation of Armenian ceramic artists, and they're all over the Old City now. They're all his students. Anywhere you go in the Old City where there's Armenian ceramics, that's his students. I'll show you the inside very soon. I'd like to focus on these pictures. Look, there's Moshe with the Luchot. Eric Gill, the same artist, wanted to represent the different cultures that are in this museum that were found in Israel. So look, there's all these Roman sarcophagi outside, and there's Samaritan stuff and Jewish stuff, Egyptian stuff, as we'll see. when we go inside. And then we have all these images. So let me just show you some pictures, because the inside with Google Earth is not so great. So I had to complement it with a lot of pictures. Let's look at a few things. Okay, so first of all, the Rockefeller. I took these pictures myself. When you walk in, they have a model of the museum, so that's kind of cool. And then I just did a tour there fairly recently with Jerusalem District communications directors in the Ministry of Education. So this is Jews and Arabs, and I did a tour for them there. There's a lot to see here for Jews and for Muslims as well, because they actually excavated on the Dome of the Rock and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and all the stuff that they took out is here in the museum. So that's also here. And here's inside that little alcove. And then this is part of the fun inside the museum, is you could just stand right up next to things. And it's not like in the Israel Museum where there's a million guards who are breathing down your neck. There's guards, but it's a lot more, let's say, loose. So there's some more of those anthropoids. And here's some little statuettes from Ashkelon, which is one of the places where the Egyptians ruled, and scarabs. This is all Egyptian stuff. This is just a teaser. I'm just warming up, right? So now let's talk about these squares, these images, which they took this picture as I was explaining them. And I'm not going to do every single one, but here's what you basically see. These 10 squares made by Eric Gill represent the 10 different cultures that were in Israel. So let's look at a few of them. The Greeks and the Romans. There's a Greek athlete, the Maccabees, Antiochus, they were in Israel, and the Romans, of course, Churban Bayit Sheni and Bar Kokhba. So that's Remus and Remulus, who are nursing from a wolf. That's the foundation legend of the Romans. And of course, the Jews, so, Moshe Rabbeinu. And then we have the Philistines on the right, because the Plishtim are Pulshim, they're invaders, they come from the Aegean Sea. On the left, we have the Canaanites, which are mostly farmers. And in the center, we have the Egyptians. And this particular image of an Egyptian who looks like he's spanking someone, this is actually a very important picture, because this has to do with the first recorded battle in human history. And it happened in Israel, and it has an interesting connection to the British Mandate. So I'm going to tie that all together in the end. Before we get to there, I want to start with jumping around the country and showing you things that you can see in the museum and around the country. So I took a few pictures in the museum. I just did a tour recently. I wasn't guiding. In this case, this guy on the left with the cowboy hat, he is an archaeologist and a tour guide. It's Dr. Achia Cohen Tavori. He has tours year-round, I think every week. He's all over the place. And he was doing a tour for tour guides in the Rockefeller Museum. So we went with a bunch of tour guides, and here we are inside one of those octagons, and I want to show you what I mean by octagon. So hang on just a moment. Let's jump inside. Here's one of them. I couldn't find the one with the Egyptian stuff. It's nobody filmed 3D inside there, but this is an octagon, sort of. And you even see the names that are carved were done during the British Mandate. So library, that's fine. Beit Asfarim. They actually, by the way, there's a whole story behind the font. They invented a Hebrew font for this museum. And there's the Arabic. So that's the library that I mentioned. And Hamishman Hatzefoni. Now, we probably have some native Hebrew speakers here, but Mishman, like Tani, Yoni, if I would ask you, what's a Mishman? What is that word?
Fat.
What?
It sounds like fat.
It sounds like Mishmanei Aretz, but it comes from the word Shmone. It's octagon. But today we say Metuman, because modern Hebrew has basically, come up with a system but this is old. This is from the British Mandate. In fact, if I could have gotten a picture of what it says here, North Octagon, what it says next to the cloakroom, it's called the Meltecha. It's called the cloakroom. It's like something out of Harry Potter. Now, the North Octagon has stuff that's more like Roman Byzantine period. So this is the famous Shalom al Israel mosaic. It's not a great picture. Here's the Ein Gedi inscription that has the zodiac and says Adam Shet Enosh on it. It's a very famous piece. And so that's that stuff. But I'm looking at the other one. So now, what I'd like to do is go back to Beit She'an, but now look at the archaeological Beit She'an and show you what we found. So, and which is in the museum. Now, unfortunately, I didn't find good images of inside the museum, but it's basically glass cases with little numbers, and you have no clue what you're looking at. So it's a fun museum to go to with a guide, but on your own, it can be a little bit frustrating. So let's go to Beit She'an and see what they found that's in this museum. So Tel Beit She'an. Tel Beit She'an in basically Emek, Israel. Here it is. It's a very powerful city. You see that it's a Roman city. I mean, you see it right away, right? There's theaters, there's colonnades. Let's just take a random spot in the city, see where it takes us. This is all the Roman city, which suffered an earthquake. Look at that marble floor. Fantastic. There's a mosaic. And since we're looking at this, I may as well mention that as nice as mosaics are, and I love to talk about mosaics, you'll know that if you've been on a few of my tours, mosaics were considered to be cheap labor. In other words, you just pay the workers, it's their time. But when the communities were able to raise more money, they would cover up the mosaics and use marble. And here's an example of that. Because marble was higher class, okay? But this is all Roman. On the top of the hill there, that's where the Egyptians ruled in Beit She'an hundreds of years before that. Let's jump to the top. Just ruins and debris, of course. Whatever they found is already in museums, but you could see that there's something here. And right there, let's move a little bit further up, is a place which is Egyptian. And the way we know that is, wait for it, here we are. See the hieroglyphics? Now, this is a copy. The original, surprise, is in the Rockefeller Museum, and you'll soon find out who was here, which pharaoh was here. And in fact, a bunch of them were here because this is a very strategic location. So the Egyptians had basically a governor who was ruling here under the auspices of a particular pharaoh. Let's see who it is. So I'm going to jump back to the Rockefeller. Now look at the black statues that are on both sides of the picture. We'll focus on each one separately. Let's start with the one on the right. This was found in Beit She'an. We found two of them. The more complete one is standing up. The other one's next to it. And this is from Seti the First. If you know your Egyptian mythology, that's the god Set who killed Mufasa. I'm sorry, I mixed it up deliberately. Who killed Osiris and tried to kill Simba, or rather Horus. Well, you have to know the mythology, but it's basically the Lion King or Macbeth. And this is Seti. So he's the wicked uncle. It's quite curious that a pharaoh would be named after one of the evil gods. Now, who is Seti the First, and what is this victory stela? So first of all, obviously he defeated the Canaanites with one of their usual revolts, and he wanted to show everyone who is boss. But who is Seti the First? Have you seen Prince of Egypt? Here he is. This is Seti the First, or can we say the stepfather of Moshe, at least according to the movie, right? His son is Ramses the Great, Ramses the Second. So this is the pharaoh that we see at the beginning of the movie. They make him like a nice grandfather figure, etc. This is Seti the First, and he's from the Prince of Egypt. And there we see on the left, we see Moshe and Ramses being reprimanded. So that's Seti the First. Now, some other things that we found, since we're talking about Ramses the Great. So in Tel El Ajul, this I'm not going to jump back into the museum to find this tiny little thing, okay? But we also found this. In Tel El Ajul, same place we found the King Tut rings, we found a ring of Ramses the Great. Now look at the image. The famous picture from the Battle of Kadesh of Ramses the Great on the left, which was used in the Prince of Egypt, by the way. They use this for the illustrations. And there you see the horses on the right. So this is Ramses the Great, and we see a scarab, a beetle, basically some dignitary or other, or somebody who was a ruler there, who ruled under the auspices of Ramses the Great. Before I drop the bombshell about Ramses the Great in Israel, I'm showing you the fun stuff, the easy stuff. So there's another one from the south, from Tel El Farah, and there he is on the right with his hands basically looking at the god Horus and basically serving him. So this is another image of Ramses the Great. But now I want to show you where Ramses the Great left an incredible footmark in Israel. And where would he visit if he was coming to Israel? Tel Aviv, of course. Well, except Tel Aviv didn't exist yet. So Jaffa. This is the port of Jaffa, one of the oldest ports in Israel. It's a very ancient port. Yonah goes to Jaffa. Shlomo Melech receives shipment in Jaffa. This is the port of Jaffa. And Tel Aviv, we know, is only there because the population density in Jaffa was insane. So they just had to find new land. And now it's the most expensive place to live in Israel, or almost. So here's the park, which anyone coming to Israel visits this park. It's called Gan Ha'atzmaut. And this park, which is right by the promenade right here, this, not the promenade, the boardwalk, this garden has a remnant that relates to Ramses the Great. What do we have here in this park? Let's take a look. And there is an archway. Now, they cleaned it up since. You could just walk down the stairs and sit there, but this is what it used to look like. Let's take a closer look. This is obviously a reconstructed replica. The original is in the museum, but take a look. This is a victory gate that was uncovered with the names of Ramses the Great. Ramses the Great was in Israel, and here it is. So if you're familiar with that park, you know that they have like a big frame with hashtag Tel Aviv Jaffa or something, and everybody takes a picture. So I thought it would be funny to do it this way. But Ramses the Great built a victory stela in Jaffa, and you can visit it. It's free. Just go there, take pictures. So that's that. Now, this adds an aspect to the conversation of dating the Exodus, because if the Exodus was under Ramses the Great, and Ramses the Great controlled Israel, then you're basically running out of his hands back into his hands. So where exactly are you escaping to if Egypt continues to rule over Israel? So there are significant details about Ramses the Great. For example, you could read Dr. Joshua Berman's Ani Ma'amin about Bible criticism, the 13 principles of faith. He goes specifically into the Song of the Sea and Ramses the Great and the Battle of Kadesh and the Tabernacle. Some interesting stuff. But on the other hand, there are those who say that if Ramses the Great is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Egypt rules Israel. So, like, what have you achieved? And we'll see in the end that has another argument against that, which we'll see soon. So the other discussion is basically asking, so what is actually happening in Israel at the time that can help us understand, like, Knisa La'aretz, is the Shoftim, like, what's happening? So you have to look at what's happening in Israel as well, not just at who is the Pharaoh in Egypt. This is part of the discussion, which again is an entire lecture, but I just want to point out this detail that you see clearly that under Ramses the Great, they ruled the coast of Israel, as well as those fake mummies. Those are from the Ramessid period. So they're in Israel. So when does Ramses fit in Jewish history? We'll have to see a little bit later. Let's move on to our other location. So back to the Rockefeller. And now I'd like to focus on the statue on the left. Now the statue on the left is a sitting Pharaoh, and this is Ramses III, also found in Bet She'an, so no need to jump back there. But Ramses III is the son, or the grandson, that is, of Ramses the Great. And this is the largest statue of a pharaoh that was found, actually made, outside of Egypt. And it's made from local stone. This is from basalt. It's from the north. So it's not even imported from Egypt. It's made locally. And it represents Ramses III. A continued presence of Egyptians in Israel 3,300 to 100 years ago. The new kingdom. And of course, remember this guy? This is Ramses III. And that's what we saw on the top of the hill in Tel Bet She'an. So here it is. And there's, of course, the rubber ducks on the top. So this is kind of fun. I'll show you one more, and then we'll move on to the next pharaoh. In Bet She'an, he also made his victory stela, and this is in the Rockefeller Museum on the right. And there's the reconstruction, another victory arch by Ramses the Great in Bet She'an. So that kind of sums up Ramses the Great. Now let's talk about a few other sites. So we were in Yafo here, which is kind of cool. But now I'd like to talk about the first recorded battle in human history, the Battle of Megiddo. I'm sure you've heard the word Armageddon. That's more of the Christian relationship to Megiddo. I'm not getting into that. That's New Testament. I have no interest in discussing that, but just mentioning it in passing that the word Megiddo has deep meaning in Christianity, and we'll see later why that plays a small role in our story, but that's as far as I'll go. Tel Megiddo is one of those cities along the coast of, not the coast, sorry, the Via Maris, which is connecting the coast to Mesopotamia. And we're looking now northeast. This is going to Mesopotamia. Anyone going from Mesopotamia has to cut through here. And that's why it's such a strategic location. So what battles actually happened in Megiddo? Well, if you ask what battles happened in Megiddo, I would like to show you briefly I actually did a tour in Megiddo for a group of Olim in Beit Shemesh, and in this picture, I'm just showing you a list of the different battles that happened in Megiddo. This is just some of them, right? There's dozens of battles that happen here. Salah ad-Din and the Crusaders, Vespasian and the Jewish rebels, Antiochus and Ptolemy the First, Thutmose III the Cat, Pepi the First. There's always something going on in Megiddo. Why is it? What is it about Megiddo? So, hold on. Okay, back on our screen. So let's zoom out for a moment and talk strategy, or rather talk geography. Okay, so if you want to get from Egypt into the trade routes of Mesopotamia, then you have several ways that you can go, and I want to show you what they are. The first one is, of course, the Via Maris, as you know, but the question is, where do you go from here? You can continue eastward, and then you have to pass by Megiddo, basically, or you can try and go north, which is called the Ladder of Tyre or Sulama Shel Tzor in our sources. The reason that going through Lebanon, through Tyre, is not advisable is you have Nahal Kishon, so you could go back to the story of Devorah and Sisera and all the mud, and the horses get stuck in the mud. It's not good terrain for going, especially in battle. It's treacherous, it's tricky. There's rivers, there's mud, there's mountains. It's very vulnerable. So it's not the best way you want to go if you want to assert control. So the best way to go is northeast. Now, zooming in, that's also why Chatzor is one of those important cities. But let's talk about Megiddo. So in Megiddo, right here in the Jezreel Valley, there are basically three cities that create kind of a triangle. Now, if you're teaching Tanakh, you'll notice, like in the Song of Devorah, but in Yoshua, these three cities are always mentioned together. Yokneam, Ta'anach, and Megiddo. Yokneam, Ta'anach, and Megiddo. Very generally speaking, Yokneam, Ta'anach, and Megiddo create a triangle of control over the path east. You have to go through them. Those three cities control the way to Mesopotamia. And that is why they're such a central strategic location. That being said, now let's actually go into Megiddo and talk about the battles of Megiddo. So here's our site. These are the powerful Iron Age gates of Megiddo. And as you go up, you can actually see some slabs from the floor. That's what remains. If you go to Chicago, the Americans actually excavated here, and what they found here is displayed in the Chicago Oriental Institute or the University of Chicago, and that's the Egyptian stuff was found right here in what remains of an Egyptian palace. We actually found ivories here, the Megiddo ivories, which are from the Bronze Age. This is very ancient, way before the Kingdom of Israel, like the time of the Avot, right? So here we are, looking at the remains of that. It's quite an impressive site. Where was I? Okay, so this is Megiddo. Now, what exactly happened in Megiddo? So, when we think about Megiddo, first of all, let's talk about a very famous Jewish story, and that is the story of Yoshiyahu HaMelech. King Yoshiyahu is killed right outside Megiddo by Pharaoh Necho. So, we're going to go into the first recorded battles of history. We're going to talk about the British mandate in the end, but just a few things about Megiddo. So Pharaoh Necho, this is Pharaoh Necho. This is actually from, the one on the left is from the Boston The one on the the one on the left is from the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, and the one on the right is from the Brooklyn Museum. These are images of Paro Necho. Paro Necho of the third intermediate period, for that reference, is the Paro who killed Yoshiyahu HaMelech. This is basically eve of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. The reason he kills Yoshiyahu in Megiddo is because that's where Yoshiyahu decides to block his advance north when he's dealing with Assyria and Babylon. He's trying to block him on his way. Because Megiddo, that's where you block him. That's where you have the upper hand, the advantage. So I wanted to mention that in general. And I want to mention a few other kings with a Jewish connection that were found in Megiddo, and then we'll get into our story. So here's two more pieces of victory arches that were found that are currently in the Rockefeller Museum. The one on the left is Shoshenk, who I'll mention who that is in a moment, and the important one with the first recorded battle is Thutmose III. So let's talk about Shoshenk for a moment, and then we'll wrap up with Thutmose and our surprise at the end. So who is Shoshenk? We have one mention of him in Tanakh, and the story in Tanakh is in conversation with a pylon, which is basically like a broad, flat kind of wall, which is basically a victory plaque that tells a story by different Egyptian kings, and this is in Luxor, and Karnak actually, which is right there, and the temple of Karnak shows on the bottom Paro Shoshenk, and many images of the different cities that he conquered, including Megiddo. So who is Shoshenk? So here's the psukim, here's the verses. This is the 5th year of Rechavam, the son of Shlomo HaMelech. Allah Shishak, and it's written Shoshek. That's how it was pronounced, or Shoshenk. Melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim. So he basically sacks the temple. ויקח את אוצרות בית השם ואת אוצרות בית המלך ואת הכל לקח. ויקח את כל מגיני הזהב אשר עשה שלמה. So basically, after that, if you continue reading the story, he sacked all the temple and took all the gold, and basically left us with like these silly copper shields, which we would bring out for ceremonies and then go and put them back in the locker room. So basically, he impoverished the temple. This is Shoshenk, who also erected a stela in Megiddo. So that's that. But now let's talk about the battle. And this is the Battle of Megiddo. The Battle of Megiddo, the first recorded battle in human history, basically is between Thutmose III and the Canaanites. And, the image that's here made by AI looks like the Pharaoh from Stargate, if you're familiar with the sci-fi movie. I think that's where it got it from. I don't know. It comes up with weird stuff. But let's talk about the story of the Battle of Megiddo. So the Battle of Megiddo and why it's so important. And this is really our end point. We just have one surprise at the end. So the Battle of Megiddo is one of those stories where the pharaohs come to show the Canaanites who's boss. And this is a battle from like 4,000 something years ago. Just so you have a reference for who Thutmose III is, he is the successor of the queen who called herself a pharaoh, Hatshepsut. You may have heard the name. There were several of those, but she's the most famous one. So what happens is the Canaanites basically want to ambush the pharaoh when he's making his way. Let's make the pharaoh in orange. Paro is coming up to attack the Canaanites who are in Megiddo, and they basically abandon a camp or pretend that they left behind a slave, or a slave like pretended to be lost or to escape, and they meet this slave. And the slave basically tells them, listen, you should go this way. I'm sort of making up the directions, but it's the basic idea. You should go this way because they won't be expecting you there, because they think you're going to come the other way. Now, whether it's through luck, serendipity, or wisdom, I don't know. Thutmose III did the unexpected thing and went the way they weren't expecting him to go. And one of the reasons he wouldn't go that way is because he's going through a very narrow pass where you could sometimes only go one person behind the other. Kind of reminds us of the Maccabee stories of the Samaria hill passes. And he surprised the Canaanites, completely surprised them, and destroyed their camps. But here's where his soldiers made a critical mistake. Instead of immediately defeating the city, which was still open and completely surprised, they spent too much time collecting the booty, collecting all the spoils of war. And meanwhile, the Canaanites were able to fortify and close the city gates, and that cost him months of work after that. So don't run for the money. Don't party when the when the Titanic leaves port. Wait for it to actually get there. But anyway, this battle, the Battle of Megiddo, was recorded on the same palace that Shoshenq wrote on, because many kings wrote there. It's on the victory pylon of Thutmose III in Karnak. And that image in the Rockefeller Museum is that picture. This is the presence of Thutmose III, the Egyptian victory over the Canaanites, who here are seen like kind of blurry people if you drink too much, but that's because they didn't do the 3D too well. It's kind of representing a lot of people. He's holding them by the head. He's holding a mace in his hand, and he's about to smash them. So this is Thutmose III, and here it is. So this is Thutmose III defeats the Canaanites in the Battle of Megiddo. Now, I'm going to wrap up here, and this is where I have a surprise story which connects to the very concept of the Fertile Crescent and the British Mandate and the Rockefeller Museum and all kinds of other fun stuff. And that has to do with one of the decisive battles that won the British the war against the Ottoman Empire in Israel, or what was known then as Palestine, and that was the Battle of Megiddo. We are talking about the General Edmund Allenby, and this is a picture of part of the Battle of Megiddo. This is an Australian cavalry, but basically this is a part of the Battle of Megiddo. And in this battle, Edmund Allenby repeats the strategy of Thutmose III. And before I ask the questions of how did he know about that, I want to show you the result. Because this battle, he was able to completely surprise the Ottomans and win the war. And the next thing he does is he basically comes to Jerusalem, right? He was basically called Sir. He was given knighthood, and he was called Allenby of Megiddo. Now, I'll send the article. This is an original article from 1926 that talks about it. He was supposed to be called Allenby of Armageddon, but because he was a Christian, he felt that that was a little bit too much. It's too intense because of the Christian connotations of that. Allenby of Megiddo. It's biblical, but it's more modest. And this is the title of this article. I think it's a New York Times article. Anyway, so we're going to talk about this story. Now, the question is this. How did Edmund Allenby know to repeat the strategy of basically going through that dangerous valley and come around and surprise the unsuspecting Ottomans who were going to ambush him the other way? Could he have possibly known about Thutmose III? I want to give us some perspective. This is a battle that happened in 1917. The Rosetta Stone was only deciphered in the 1850s, and only once they were able to figure out the code, now you have a tremendous corpus of hieroglyphics that you have to go and study. So it's very unlikely that he would have had access to that knowledge a mere 50 years after the decoding of the hieroglyphics for the first time. And they were just starting to figure it out. In addition to that, and I read this book about the stories of Megiddo, is everywhere Allenby went, he always had two books with him. He had a Bible, and he had I don't remember the exact publication, but a particular biblical atlas. Like he carried those books everywhere. So he knew geography, he knew Tanakh, he was very into this stuff. But could he have read the book? The only book that existed at the time that told the story of Thutmose III was written by the American archaeologist James Henry Breasted. And James Henry Breasted is the founder of the Chicago Oriental Institute. He actually excavated in Megiddo, and he wrote the story, and he coined the term Fertile Crescent. By the way, that's a fun fact. He coined the term Fertile Crescent, Hasahar HaPoreh, as we call it in Hebrew. And he basically believed that if you want to understand Tanakh, you need to look at Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and end with basically the Persian period and don't go beyond that into Greek and Roman stuff. That's Tanakh, and that's how the museum in Chicago was built. If we'd have more time, I would also go into that. But at other times, we've gone to that museum, and we hopefully will in the future. So to wrap up this story, after the victory, and here's the famous pictures of Allenby arrival in Jerusalem. You see Allenby's arrival on the left. He gets off his horse and walks on foot into Jaffa Gate. And we used to have a clock tower. Unfortunately, Back to the Future didn't work here, so Save the Clock Tower didn't happen. It's down, but there used to be a clock tower. And what Allenby says is, I walk into Jerusalem as a pilgrim, not as a conqueror, which is a very powerful statement. He's walking on foot. You can see this on video on YouTube. And on the right, he's standing right outside the Tower of David. And when you stand there now, there's a plaque with that picture and an explanation, delivering an address to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This begins the British Mandate of Palestine. This is 1917, and this is where the Ottomans lost to the Allies and the British, and here it is. Now, there is a record of a conversation in Cairo right after this, maybe a year after this, where Breasted and Allenby meet, and Allenby was overheard telling Breasted, "I took a leaf out of your book." So it's very likely that he had access to that book because of that, except that until that conversation was known, how could he have possibly known? Like, was the book even available in that part of the world? So, like, we take it for granted. So apparently he knew the story. And that is the story of the pharaohs in Israel. And I want to wrap up with one last thing, which is, you may have heard of this, it's very famous, but the first mention of Israel in extra-biblical archaeology and extra-biblical sources, and that ties into the conversation of dating the Exodus. So this is by Pharaoh Merneptah. Pharaoh Merneptah is none other than the son and successor of Ramses the Great. And he made another victory stela, which is actually in Cairo. And if you want to know how to write Israel in hieroglyphics, that's how you write Israel in hieroglyphics. I have a t-shirt that says that, right? It says Israel. It's actually Israel. They don't have a lamed in their language. Kind of like Japanese also, some sounds that they don't pronounce. So here's the picture of it. And now let's quickly read some of the more important passages in it. So first of all, this is a victory stela. So he's trying to show what he's achieved and how the different nations responded to him. The princes are prostrate, saying peace. In other words, everybody's bowing down and saying, you know, we accept your sovereignty. Not one raises his head among the nine bows. Desolation is for Jenehu. Hatti is pacified. Now, Israel is generally considered to be part of the district of Hatti, of the Hittites. And here's our key line. Now, this is part of it. It's a very long inscription. Plundered is Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. So remember, the Egyptians controlled Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gezer. And I was just there in Gezer 2 weeks ago. The Gezer calendar is the oldest Hebrew calendar. I got some fun stuff about that. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. Karu has become a widow because of Egypt. So basically he's going on and on saying, me, look what I've done. Now here's an interesting point. Is he telling the truth? Has Israel indeed been laid waste? Well, the fact that you're sitting here is proof that it's not, right? So it's not true. So the question is, can you trust what the pharaohs write about themselves? And we know that the answer is no. What they usually do is make things that glorify them. They're not honest about history, which is why you always have to be careful what you read about the Egyptians. So that will tie in, for example, to the conversation about, is there any evidence of a colony, not a colony, a society of slaves living in Egypt? Like, why would a pharaoh ever bother wasting time writing anything about that, right? Or writing anything about being beaten up and kick their butts? Like, why would I write about that? They would never write about that. But in addition to that, the question of, if we left Egypt under Ramses the Great, a mere 40 years later, we're in the midst of conquering the land of Canaan, assuming we found our way, through the desert. And there's a bit of leeway because Ramses the Great ruled for 62 years. So the question is, at what point did you leave? And there were points where we could have left, where he was weaker. It is possible. But in any event, like, the description of, we've destroyed all of Israel and their land, like, we're still in this, like, we're in the midst of conquering this city and that city. It doesn't really fit. We're not there yet. We haven't really placed our roots into Israel. So that's why, I'm just going to wrap up with this idea. That's why other scholars who say that the Exodus is too late, it can't be Ramses. The Exodus has to be about 200 years earlier, under Amenhotep II, for example, was like the great-great-grandfather of King Tut. That makes more sense because 200 years later, you're well into the time of the Shoftim, of the judges, and that would explain what Marneptah writes. He's basically talking about a limited area of Israelites who he was able to lay waste to, maybe a few along the coast, and that's it. right? But it's good enough to make it like, look me, look what I did. I destroyed them all. It's good enough. Who's gonna argue? So that's the basic story. So what we've seen is that many different pharaohs were in Israel, and they were here rather in ancient Canaan because it controls the trade routes between the ancient Near East, basically Mesopotamia and Egypt, and they maintained control back and forth over time. And even before they controlled it, they did have trade connections with Israel. And you could still see a lot of their stuff in the Rockefeller, in Yaffo, and in other places.